She found a rusted key in her father's toolbox. It opened a barn sealed since 1959. What she discovered inside wasn't just a family's past. It was a choice that would redefine her future and force her to decide what the word home truly meant. If you've ever felt like you were starting over with nothing but ghosts at your back, I think you'll understand this story. Do me a favor and hit that subscribe button, because this is a place for people who have had to find their own way, and we're all in it together. The box was the color of a faded bruise. It sat on polished linoleum in the administrative office, a dented metal rectangle holding the entirety of my inheritance. 18 years I'd lived in rooms with beige walls and furniture bolted to the floor. Today, on my 18th birthday, I was being handed this toolbox and my walking papers. Mr. Henderson, my caseworker for the last 4 years, nudged it toward me with the toe of his sensible shoe. He was a man built from soft edges and exhausted kindness. His face wore that expression he saved for difficult goodbyes, professional sympathy threaded with genuine regret. Underscore, underscore, quote, underscore, 0, underscore, underscore. I stared at the box. Not at Mr. Henderson, not at the release forms spread across his desk. At the box. Heavy duty, the kind a mechanic or carpenter would own. Rusted clasp, the faint, lingering scent of oil and sawdust reaching me even from across the room. My father. I possessed 2 faded photographs of him and a collection of state-sanctioned narratives. He was a transient, a handyman, a man who couldn't stay put. He'd signed over his rights when I was 3 and died in a construction accident when I was 10. The stories never quite aligned, but they all arrived at the same destination: me, alone. Quote 1. The words came out small, thin, the kind of voice you use when you're fighting to keep it steady. I'm afraid so, he said gently. He slid a thick manila envelope across the desk. This too. It's the deed to a piece of property he owned out in a town called Havenwood. It's not much, Alara. The social services report says the house is uninhabitable. Condemned, most likely. But it's in your name now. He sighed, the sound of paperwork and bureaucracy given breath. You have 90 days to pay the back taxes, about $2,000. Otherwise, the county seizes it and auctions it off. Honestly, letting it go might be the smartest move. There's a standing offer from a local developer for $5,000. It's not a lot, but it would be a start for you. A start. I thought about the $112 on the state-issued debit card in my pocket. $5,000 felt like a fortune. A bus ticket to anywhere. A security deposit. A few months of not checking over my shoulder. The sensible choice. But the property, this worthless, forgotten scrap of dirt, was the only other thing besides the toolbox that carried his name. The only other thing that was mine. I picked up the toolbox. The metal handle was cold, solid against my palm. It felt real, substantial, a weight pressing back against the lightness of my own existence. I could feel the contents shift and clatter inside. I'll think about it, I said, my standard answer for anything I refused to discuss. Back in my room, the one I had to vacate by 5 o'clock, I placed the box on the stripped mattress. The institutional quiet of the group home pressed close around me. For years I had dreamed of this day. Freedom. Now that it had arrived, it felt less like an open door and more like being shoved off a ledge. I ran my fingers across the rusted clasp. Not locked. With a screech of metal on metal, I lifted the lid. The smell hit me again, stronger now. Motor oil, damp earth, and something else beneath it, faint, like old paper. Inside was a mess of carefully organized chaos. Wrenches and screwdrivers nestled in fitted slots, mismatched sockets rattling in a tray. But underneath a grease-stained rag, I found a small, velvet pouch, the kind meant for jewelry. My breath caught. I had never imagined my father as someone who would own anything delicate. Inside the pouch wasn't a ring or a watch. It was a single, heavy, old-fashioned key. Iron, dark, and pitted with rust. An ornate circular head and a complex toothed bit. The thing looked like it belonged to a castle gate, not a workman's chest. I tried it against the toolbox lock anyway. Pure impulse. It didn't fit. I set it down and kept searching. Nothing else personal remained. No letters, no photographs. Only tools. The anonymous instruments of a craftsman's life. And this strange, silent key. It was the only object in that entire chest without an obvious function. It felt like a question stripped of its context, a loose thread dangling from a story nobody ever told me. $5,000 from the developer was the rational choice. A clean exit. A new beginning, unburdened by a condemned structure and a dead man's belongings. But as I lowered the lid, my fingers found the iron key one more time. Its weight held me like an anchor dug into mud. And I knew, with a certainty that mocked every logical thought in my head, that I could not surrender this property until I discovered what lock that key was meant for. The bus to Havenwood dragged me slowly out of every familiar thing. The city's grey geometry and concrete skyline dissolved into endless suburbs, then surrendered entirely to open country. For hours I watched cornfields and soybean rows slide past the glass, interrupted by clusters of dark trees and the occasional collapsing farmhouse. A world I had only ever encountered in photographs. The air pumping through the bus vents tasted recycled and stale. But at a tiny crossroads stop, nothing there but a gas station and a diner, I stepped off and filled my lungs for the first time. The air hung thick with damp earth, fresh-cut grass, and the promise of distant rain. Clean, heavy, it made my chest feel wider. I bought a lukewarm coffee inside, and the man behind the register, wiry, old, with gentle eyes, asked where I was headed. When I said the old Miller place, something shifted in his face. "Quote 6, he said quietly. "Quote 7. I nodded. The complicated truth wasn't worth explaining. "Well," he said, sliding my change across the counter. "Good luck to you then." The way those words landed felt weighted. Pity braided with curiosity. The bus left me at the edge of town. A drowsy grid of brick buildings and wide, silent streets. Mr. Henderson's directions led me down the main road, which narrowed into a county lane, which crumbled into gravel. 2 miles on foot, the heavy toolbox banging against my thigh, a duffel holding everything I owned, cutting into my shoulder. The gravel surrendered to a dirt path flanked by shoulder-high weeds and wild flowers. Then I saw it, a rusted mailbox leaning on its post, the name Miller barely visible beneath a crust of lichen and oxidation. Beyond it, a rutted driveway vanished into a wall of trees. My heart slammed against my ribs. This was it, my father's land, my land. I pushed through a curtain of low-hanging branches and stepped onto the property. The word uninhabitable was generous. The house was a skeleton. Its roof bowed in the center like a spine that had given up. Windows boarded or shattered. The porch tilted sideways, its planks rotten and colorless. Nature was consuming it, vines scaling the walls, young trees punching through the steps. Exactly as worthless as everyone said. Despair hit like cold water poured down my back. The developer's $5,000 was worth more than this entire place. That offer was a mercy. I should have taken it. I should be riding toward a city right now, not standing in wreckage. I dropped my bags on what remained of the porch and stood motionless. Insects droned. Leaves whispered in the wind. A silence lived here, something older and deeper than the city's noise could ever touch. Defeated, I decided to walk the property line, see the full scope of my inheritance before calling the developer to surrender. The land stretched farther than I expected, a few acres at least, a wild knot of woods and meadows. As I rounded a dense cluster of oaks, I saw the second structure, a barn. Enormous. Unlike the house, it had endured the years with stubborn dignity. Dark, weathered wood. Its gambrel roof still held straight and true against the sky. Massive doors sealed the front, held shut by a thick wooden beam, and bolts rusted completely solid. It looked less like a building and more like a vault. It stood there, majestic and threatening, a silent colossus presiding over the house's slow collapse. I circled its perimeter, dragging my palm along rough, splintering planks. On the far side, nearly swallowed by wild lilac gone feral, I found a smaller door, human-sized, built from the same brutal timber and fastened with a padlock thick as my fist. The lock was a monster of old iron, crusted in bright orange rust. But its shape stopped me cold. Ornate, circular, identical to the head of the key from my father's belongings. My breath caught hard. I dug into my pocket with clumsy fingers, pulled out the key. My hands wouldn't stop shaking. The thing looked ancient, a relic pulled from some other century. I held it up against the lock. A perfect match. The key slid in with a dry, scraping whisper. Stiff. Decades of disuse had seized the mechanism, and for one terrible moment I believed it was useless. It refused to turn. I braced my shoulder against the door, threw my body weight into it, teeth clenched. Davies's offer flickered through my mind. $5,000, a clean break. No mysteries, no rusted locks, no collapsing houses. Just money and a future I could steer with my own hands. But the solid heft of that key, the way it seated so perfectly in this impossible lock, it was a connection. A message left across years. My father had kept this key apart from everything else, tucked in velvet, hidden deliberately. He wanted it found. One last desperate shove. A groaning crack split the silence as decades of corrosion surrendered. The shackle popped free with a sigh of released pressure. My hands shook so violently I could barely wrestle the padlock loose. The door was impossibly heavy. I hauled on the iron handle and it fought back, grinding against the warped frame. I squeezed through the gap I'd forced open and plunged into cool, absolute darkness. Air rolled over me, thick and motionless. It carried the smell of ancient hay, dry earth, and something deeper. The scent of sealed time, preserved. undisturbed. I stood just inside the threshold, letting my eyes struggle toward adjustment, my heart hammering against the vast, resonant quiet. The darkness was nearly total. Thin slivers of daylight pierced through cracks in the plank walls like laser beams, catching swirling galaxies of dust suspended in their paths. Stepping inside felt like entering a cathedral built for forgotten things. Slowly, my vision sharpened. The scale revealed itself. The ceiling soared overhead, laced with massive crossbeams where swallows had nested years ago. The main floor stretched out, cavernous, populated by ghostly shapes beneath heavy canvas tarps. A hulking form at center was likely a tractor. Others suggested plows, threshers, old wagons. Everything wore the same uniform coat of grey dust, a soft shroud that erased edges and swallowed sound. A museum of a life interrupted without warning. I moved deeper, each footstep releasing small clouds from the wooden boards beneath me. The silence was so total, I could hear my own breath whispering, my own pulse thumping. The space felt sacred, deliberately sealed away from the living world. In the far corner, partitioned off from the machinery graveyard, I found a workstation. A heavy wooden bench stood flush against the wall, its surface marked with the faint silhouettes of tools long removed, their ghosts outlined in dust. A pegboard above held what remained: a rusted handsaw, a pair of pliers, a hammer with a handle worn smooth from years of grip. This corner had been used more recently than anything else in the barn. The dust sat thinner here, the air less dead. This was my father's space. I knew it the way you know a voice before you see a face. It carried his same energy of organized purpose, the same deliberate arrangement as his toolbox. And there on the workbench, pushed back against the wall, sat a small, olive-green metal box, the kind meant for ammunition or critical documents. Closed, not locked. My hands, still black from fighting the padlock, trembled as I reached for it. The hinges shrieked in protest as I lifted the lid. Inside, resting on a bed of yellowed cotton, lay a stack of envelopes bound together with faded twine. Addressed to me, for Alara, written in a strong, masculine hand. The ink slightly faded, but perfectly clear. I lowered myself onto a wooden crate, the metal box resting heavy on my thighs. I couldn't bring myself to open them. These letters came from a ghost, a man I'd assembled entirely from scraps of other people's memories and my own childhood fantasies. To hear his voice, even through ink on paper, felt like it might destroy the fragile truce I'd negotiated with his absence. But I hadn't come all this way to stop now. I untied the twine, picked up the first envelope. The date on it fell just after my 16th birthday. My fingers trembled as I unfolded the single clean page. Quote 10. Quote, it began. Quote 11. Quote, I had to stop. A sob, thick, jagged, painful, ripped itself from my chest. I pressed the heels of my palms against my eyes, trying to dam the tears already coursing down my face. My entire life, I had carried the story of my abandonment like a stone lodged in my gut. He didn't want me. I was too much trouble. He walked away. Simple, brutal, a narrative that had shaped every corner of who I became. And in a single paragraph, this letter was trying to demolish it all. I drew a long, shuddering breath and made myself keep reading. This farm, this barn, it's more than just land. It's a legacy, and it's a burden. My grandfather, your great-grandfather Samuel Miller, was the one who sealed this place. He did it in the fall of 1959, walked out, locked that side door, and never stepped inside again. He told my father the world had changed, that the work they did here was no longer safe. I didn't understand what he meant until I was a young man and found his journals. He wasn't just a farmer, Elara. He was a man who helped people. This barn was a sanctuary. And some things, once they run in your blood, you cannot outrun. When you were born, I looked at you and saw all the goodness in the world. I knew I couldn't chain you to this place, to its history, to its dangers. So I made a choice. I let the state believe I was a deadbeat. I let them take you, to give you a clean start. A life untouched by the shadows hanging over this family. Every day since, I have been trying to earn enough to give you a real choice when the time came. I hope I managed it. There is more for you to find here. Look for the place where the work was done, under the bench. The foundation is older than the rest. Be careful. And know, please know, that not a single day passed without you in my thoughts. You are my everything, my true north. Your loving father, Thomas Miller. I read the letter a second time, then a third, the words swimming through tears. I wept for the little girl who believed she was unwanted. I wept for the man who had lived alone with this secret, convinced he was doing right. I wept for the years stolen from us, the conversations that would never happen now. The grief was physical, a crushing pressure behind my ribs.
He hadn't abandoned me.
He had hidden me, sacrificed his own name, his own life beside me, to hand me a shot at something ordinary. The anger I'd carried so long dissolved into a deep, aching sorrow. The growl of a car engine climbing the long driveway jolted me from my grief. I wiped my face fast, stuffed the letter back into the box. My heart hammered with a different kind of fear now. I crept to the gap in the barn door and looked out. A sleek, black sedan sat parked near the crumbling porch. A man in a tailored suit stepped out, clipboard in hand. He surveyed the condemned house with visible contempt, then his gaze swept the property and lingered on the barn. The developer.
He hadn't even waited for me to call.
He was here to apply pressure, to lean on the orphan he assumed was desperate. The man, Davies, according to the business card he wedged into the front door, represented the easy path out. His presence was the choice I faced made flesh. I stayed crouched in that barn until his car vanished down the dirt track. Engine noise swallowed by the afternoon stillness. My thoughts spiraled. $5,000, the developer's offer that had felt like salvation just hours before, now landed like a slap. A bribe. Hush money to erase a history I was only beginning to piece together. Selling this land meant selling my father's sacrifice, Samuel Miller's legacy. It meant grabbing the cash and disappearing, exactly the way I'd always believed my father had done. An act of erasure, accepting the simple, brutal story and turning my back on the complicated, agonizing truth. My father's letter had handed me a new narrative, but that narrative carried weight. The back taxes hadn't vanished. $2,000 remained an impossible number. The house was still collapsing in on itself. My future stretched ahead, just as formless as it had that morning. The only thing different now was the past. Have you ever stood in a moment like that? Handed a truth so heavy it threatens to crush you. But you know, somewhere deep beneath your ribs, that you cannot look away from it. A moment where you discover what you're actually built from. Tell me in the comments if you've ever faced a choice that rewrote who you are. I genuinely believe our stories bind us together, and I read every single one. Now, back to that barn. I knew I couldn't stand there frozen between grief and confusion, letting paralysis make the decision for me. My father's words rang through my skull. __quote _13__. The workbench. I turned toward that small, dust-caked workstation. My eyes traced the thick wooden surface, old, rough-hewn planks bolted directly to the barn wall. I dropped to my hands and knees, floorboards cool and gritty against my palms. The air tasted of dust and damp earth. I ran my fingers across every board beneath the bench. Solid, unremarkable, no different from the rest, but my father's words had been precise. The foundation is older than the rest. I leaned closer, using my phone's flashlight to slice through the dimness. The boards directly beneath the bench. They were different wood. The rest of the barn floor was wide-planked pine. These were narrower, dense, dark oak strips, and one of them, close to the wall, bore a tiny notch carved into its edge, almost invisible. My pulse quickened. I tried prying it with my fingers. Nothing. Fitted too tight. I scanned the workstation and spotted a thin, flat pry bar dangling from a nail on the pegboard. Rusted, but solid. I wedged the bar's edge into the hairline gap beside that notch and leaned my weight backward. The ancient wood groaned. Splinters peeled away. Nothing moved. Despair surged through me. The terrible possibility that I'd imagined everything. That I was just some girl chasing phantoms in a forgotten barn. I shifted the bar, found better leverage, threw every pound I had into it. A sharp crack. The board's end lifted 2 inches, releasing a breath of stale, underground air. It smelled of deep soil and buried things. I worked the pry bar along the plank's full length until it came free in my hands. Set it aside. Peered into the dark below. Not just dirt. A hollow space, stone-lined, deliberately built into the foundation. And resting inside it, another box. Larger than the first. A metal Strongbox, the kind you'd find in an old bank vault. Heavy enough that dragging it out of that compartment and into a sliver of afternoon light took everything I had. Unlike the first box, this one was secured with a small brass lock. Sturdy. And there was no key. My stomach dropped. All this way, just to be stopped by one final barrier. I glanced at the tools on the pegboard, the heavy hammer. But I couldn't bring myself to smash it open. That felt like desecration. Then a thought struck. The toolbox. My father's toolbox. I bolted out to the porch, mind racing. That box was full of implements meant for repair. But maybe, just maybe, it also held the means to unlock what was hidden. I carried it back into the barn, knelt beside the Strongbox, dug through the trays, past wrenches and sockets. My fingers grazed something small and metallic. A tiny set of lockpicks rested inside a leather sleeve, the kind a handyman might carry for honest work, or for something far less innocent. My father, apparently, had possessed talents no one ever told me about. I had 0 training with these tools, but I also had 0 options. I selected the most basic-looking pick and slid it into the keyhole, scraped it, wiggled it, listened to the faint metallic whispers inside the mechanism, guided by nothing but gut feeling and sheer need. Minutes bled into forever. Right at the edge of surrender, I felt it. A subtle click, the tiniest shift deep within the lock's guts. I twisted the tension wrench. The lock gave way. I raised the heavy lid of the strongbox, my breath locked somewhere behind my ribs. Everything inside had been packed with surgical precision. On top sat another bundle of letters, tied with the same rough twine as before. Beneath them, wrapped carefully in oilcloth, lay several thick bricks of cash. I pulled one free. Old bills, 50s and 100s, cool and crisp against my fingertips. I counted one bundle quickly. $5,000. At least 10 bundles filled the box. $50,000. Maybe more. A sum that could remake a life entirely. Enough to cover the taxes, restore the house, fund a college education. Enough to become anyone. This was the choice my father had wanted to leave me. But staring at that money, I knew with absolute certainty it wasn't the most important thing in that box. The real treasure, the true inheritance, waited in the letters underneath. I moved the cash aside and lifted the older stack. These were different. The paper had yellowed deeper. The handwriting belonged to someone else. Not my father. His grandfather, Samuel Miller, the man who had sealed the barn. These were his journals. I started reading, and the hidden history of that quiet barn and this forgotten farm unspooled before my eyes. Samuel Miller, my great-grandfather, had been part of a network, a kind of modern-day underground railroad. It began after the war, helping displaced families, people who had lost everything, people fleeing persecution in Europe, find new lives in America. He wasn't a spy, wasn't a soldier, just a farmer with a large barn and an unshakable sense of what was right. This barn, this supposed agricultural building, had been a way station. The journal entries described families arriving in the dead of night, terrified, exhausted. They would shelter in a secret cellar beneath the hayloft, a space I hadn't even discovered yet, while Samuel and his wife arranged their passage further west. He never accepted payment. He did it because he believed human duty demanded nothing less. The entries held brief, devastating descriptions. A young boy tasting fresh milk for the first time, a woman weeping at the simple gift of a warm blanket, a family singing quiet songs in a language he couldn't recognize. It was a story of immense courage wrapped in profound silence. Then the entries shifted. The year was 1959. The Cold War gripped everything, and the nature of their work had transformed. They were no longer simply helping refugees. They were sheltering defectors, people carrying dangerous knowledge. The risks multiplied beyond calculation. The final entry was dated October 17th, 1959. Short. The handwriting trembling. They almost found us tonight. A car on the lane, lights cut. We got the family out through the woods just in time, but it was too close. I saw the look in my son's eyes. I cannot put my family in this danger anymore. The world has become too small for this kind of work. The risk is no longer just mine to bear. Tomorrow, I am sealing the barn. I will leave the tools on the bench as a monument to what we did. But this chapter is over. May God forgive me for the ones I can no longer help. That was it. He had walked away. Locked the door on his life's most important work, to protect his son, my grandfather. The legacy passed down through generations as a silent, dormant secret. My father had found these journals exactly as I had now. He understood the weight of what his grandfather had done. He felt the responsibility that came welded to that knowledge. His own letters, the final few in the pile, explained the rest. He had been slowly, carefully trying to determine what to do with all of it. He felt pulled toward honoring his grandfather's mission, toward using this property for something good again. But he was also terrified. The same dangers that had forced his grandfather to seal the barn. Those dangers hadn't simply vanished, and the thought of dragging me into that danger paralyzed him. His last letter was written mere weeks before his death. It read, he never got to finish. He died before any of it could be set into motion, leaving the choice, the burden, and the legacy squarely on my shoulders. I sat on the dusty barn floor, letters and journals fanned out around me, the money stacked in a neat pile nearby. Slivers of light through the walls had deepened to gold, marking the day's end. I was no longer an orphan with nothing. I was the keeper of a secret, the heiress to a legacy of courage, the recipient of a father's desperate, all-consuming love. The decision was no longer about selling or keeping a scrap of land. It was about what I owed the past and what I wanted to build for the future. The air inside the barn cooled as the sun dropped below the horizon. But I didn't move. I sat there in the gathering twilight, surrounded by the ghosts of my family. The weight of their stories settled over me, not as a burden, as a blanket. For the first time in my entire life, I felt belonging, a connection to something larger than my own small, lonely existence. The developer's offer, the sensible path, was now unthinkable. Selling this land would be like ripping out the final page of a book I was only beginning to read. It was a sanctuary. My father's letter had named it that. My great-grandfather's actions had made it so. It had sheltered strangers in their most desperate hour. Now it sheltered me. The $50,000 wasn't just a fresh start. It was a set of tools. The means to honor what came before and build what came next. My father's plan had been to give the property away, to shield me from it entirely. But he didn't know who I would become. He didn't know that the girl raised in the sterile, rootless machinery of the system would hunger for legacy more than a clean slate. I wanted the roots. I wanted the history. I wanted the weight of responsibility pressing into my palms. This was no longer his story to finish. It was mine. The next morning, I woke on a pile of old canvas tarps, stiff and cold, but carrying a clarity of purpose I had never once felt before. I peeled $2,000 from one of the cash bundles, slid it into an envelope, and walked 2 miles back into town. The county clerk's office sat in a small brick building on the town square. The woman behind the counter studied me with that same mixture of curiosity and pity the man at the gas station had offered. "Here to pay back taxes on the Miller property," I said. My voice was clear, steady. I pushed the envelope across the counter. She counted the bills, eyebrows lifting slightly, stamped a form with a satisfying thud. Just like that, the land was truly mine. The first threat dissolved. My next stop was a payphone outside the general store. I found the business card Mr. Davies had left and dialed. He picked up on the first ring, voice smooth and assured. "Davies, this is Alara Miller," I said, "regarding